There's a lot of these sort of students. So students with a specific learning disability, these are the most numerous. They're twice as numerous as anything of any other group. And even though the categories are outlined in the back of the board packet for you, I did want to just tell you who falls into the specific learning disability. This disability involves the inability to understand or use language that results in the inability to listen, speak, read, write, or do mathematical calculations. So, an example of this is dyslexia. So it's the inability to understand or use language, but it's different from a communication disability. You can read a little bit more about it in the back of the board packet. So in Washington, the fastest growing group, I'm circling the autism students. Autism students represent, there's about 10,000 of them in Washington in 2014. This is about 7% of the total students with disability population, and they are also the fastest growing group in the state. These groups that are showing big declines in recent years, these are relatively small populations of students, so a small population change results in a larger percentage change. But this is a big group with a big change, autism. So I now want to look at some performance data that I just received from OSPI last Thursday afternoon. So I haven't had much of a chance to really look at this, but I have created a few charts for you to look at student performance by category here. So several things to note here. On average, and regardless of disability category, the students with disability perform lower than students with no disability. And with the exception of the one group, the reading proficiency rates are always higher than the math proficiency rates. And I want to point out, students with a specific learning disability, this is a pretty low performing group in general. They represent roughly a third of all Washington students with disability. This is a similar chart for middle schools. So a couple of things here. You'll see that the chart looks very similar. You'll see that one of the disability categories has been removed. That would be the developmental delays. Developmental delays are not identified after age 9. If a student identified for developmental delay remains in special ed, they're reclassified as some other disability. For high schools, you'll see something similar. The proficiency rates are a little bit higher, just as they are for the other assessments, for the other groups of students in Washington. So the thing I want to point out is that regardless of school level, elementary, middle, and high school, there's 4 disability types that are relatively higher performing for all of those groups. That would be students with autism, orthopedic impairments, visual impairments, or communication disorders. For all grade levels, these are the highest performing groups. For all grade levels, these are the lowest performing groups. So we have some new information here to think about, especially as we examine performance of students with disabilities. We see 4 groups where there's higher performers, and we see a number of other groups where there's lower performers. We see the students with specific learning disability, the largest group in the state is amongst the lowest performing of all the groups also. So something I want to sort of throw out here. We characterize the students with disability group as a low performing group because we've aggregated it, we've diluted the information that we've accumulated from this group. And I'm just not sure if it's really the best way to go. So I bring you back to our question. School A, School B. it looks pretty straightforward. We said school B, based on our focus school identification process, is the lowest performing. This school, and I do need to make this clear, these are real schools now. This is not made up data, this is real schools. School B was identified as a focus school. School A was not. School B gets prioritized for supports and resources. School A does not. So this is what School A looks like. School A is students that are mostly communication disorders and health impairments. This is one of the higher performing groups across the state. However, this group is only performing at about 14% proficiency in reading and math. As a state average, they should be performing at about 43%. So this group at this school, this group is underperforming by 68% compared to their statewide peers. Remember, School A was not identified. School B was identified as a focus school. So School B is made up of mostly students with a specific learning disability. They're performing pretty close to what we would expect them to do. So it's what we're looking at here is kind of a double achievement gap. We have an achievement gap where students with disability are performing lower than students without a disability. But in School A, we have a second achievement gap, and that would be a gap between the students with disabilities group. They're performing lower than their non-disabled students and lower than their peers. So there's two achievement gaps here. Here there's only the one achievement gap, the large one between students with disability and not with a disability. So how does this look? Remember, School B was our focus school. School A was not. You can see here, this is how the school is actually performing, and this is how their peers are performing across the state. So you've got Achievement Gap 1 and Achievement Gap 2. For School B, that was identified as a focus school, you've got students with disabilities performing very similar to their statewide peers, yet a large gap here. So one way we might consider a methodology to improve our identifications here is to consider grade level bands for focus schools, and we also might want to start considering the disability type at the various school. You know, if you look at School B, you know, we followed the process and they are a low performing school and they need resources and supports. I would argue that School A also needs prioritized supports and resources from OSPI. So in this case, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not sure if the correct school was identified here. I think somebody could make an argument that School A is really the one that needs additional supports here. School B needs them, but maybe School A does also. So over the next couple of months, I'm going to be looking at some of the biasing effects of this aggregation we do to see how it really impacts schools and how we might be changing that. I hope to have that for you at the board retreat coming up in July. So are we going to take questions now, or are we going to go right into Parker's?
Connie? The specific learning disability, that one, I had lots of questions about when I read it initially. And I am not an expert in this field, but it seems to me we one of those things like, it just seemed to me like it was like the discipline, where we have this undefined, category of kids that are being disciplined, and until you really get in and figure out what it is, it's hard to deal with it, and it turns out to be, a lot of times they're talking back to the teacher or something that's far less serious than pulling out a knife or whatever that is. So, can we talk more about that specific learning disability category and how people are diagnosed? Yeah.
Yeah, there's probably a better conversation to be had with OSPI special ed folks. And in a couple of communications with them, I'm told in no uncertain terms that the term IEP represents individual education plan. So especially with the students with a specific learning disability, it really is a highly specialized, a highly individualized, placed in that category for a very specific reason. And going from one student to the next, to the next, to the next would be very different. You know, they could look very, very different and manifest in very different ways, yet they're put into the single group. And it might be, you know, similar to what you say to the discipline group, the other. You know, if there is a disability and they can't place them into one of the other 13 categories, then I believe they look to this the specific learning disability and come up with a very individualized diagnosis and plan for that. So I think what you're saying is right.
Cindy, then Peter.
Thank you. This slide says a couple things to me. One is, follows on with what Connie was saying, but the whole IEP process is to identify the student's potential, their accommodations, and their trajectory, if you will. And it's not on either one of these charts, because it's measured against the tests that all students take, correct? So we don't know if a student is succeeding under his or her IEP or not. School B looks to me to be the example of how we should increase funding across the state to all students with disabilities and raise the whole bar up as much as we can. In School A, I would agree with you that it's a focus school because it doesn't seem to be doing as well as its peers in being able to meet the needs of the students with disabilities. But there may be reasons for that. They may have students who have just come to them that they have not been educating, or newly identified disabilities that they don't have a program that's as good as some of the other programs they have. But I would ask you to look at in the geographical areas, why it might be that we have concentration. I think it could be because of resources available in the community itself or in a school district, and it actually attracts families with students with disabilities. And also resources like the University of Washington and their Autism Center or what have you. I think if we can start understanding that background, that context, that will help us in our decision making, but will also help us help districts or schools find resources to actually raise the bar. But I think those two charts talk about two different things. And in particular, I would hope we would start advocating based on School B that the whole funding situation needs to rise for students with disabilities, so that across the state their needs can be met, in addition to the focus school additional resources.
Peter, excuse me, Peter, and then Dan. Andrew, do I recall correctly that a fair number of schools are identified as focus or priority, mainly because of the student with disability category? Sometimes there's overlap, but a fair number get tripped up, if you will, in that category. Is that
Correct. One of the charts showed of focus schools, 75% identified.
right? So I guess my takeaway from this is sort of twofold. One is that because of the huge range of these disabilities, this is especially in the area of students with disability, we're capturing an idea, but it's too blurred and for action in and of itself. And the other is that I can see from some of the schools that are listed here, it depends a lot on the school. And Cindy mentioned this. There are schools where, especially in larger districts, for example, there are locus of certain programs to provide services for those students. And it also could be because of number of recent immigrants, for example. So it almost takes a school-by-school analysis to know what the particular needs of that school are. And I guess that speaks to me of working, if we use the Achievement Index for identifying focus priority schools, to then make really sure that that's simply an identification, but it's not necessarily identification of the particular needs or situation in that school, and especially in this, and that's true more generally, but especially in the students with disability area, we want to be very careful that we're providing something that's of use to that school as opposed to some generalized label. Now that's not true for all schools, because some schools, they have just general population, they happen to have so many disabled students or in this category, and they may or may not be serving those students as best they could. But it's very different for some schools, and even with some school districts. Tuckwell is an example.